All right, so this is Extreme User Interfaces for Alfresco. My name's Kevin Dorr. I'm the Solutions Engineer for the US Partner Channel, and I see some of the partners here, at least a couple of them. And so that'll have a little bit of bearing on some things I'll say later. So what I'm going to do today is I'm going to talk a little bit about some user interface concepts that are already in the product in different places so that you can use those as examples and places to kind of guide you in how to do things. And then I'm going to go through an example of how to construct a user interface for Share, a new page for Share. And I'll have a couple of other surprise announcements at the end. So that said, let's jump into the presentation here. So I'm going to start off by showing some user interfaces that are known and loved by you all. So the basic thing that we have to begin with, basically, is Alfresco Share. And there's a number of different ways that you can customize Share fairly easily without really doing a lot of work. So there's the surfbug interface that some of you are probably familiar with that's on the index page for Share, and you can use that to outline different pieces of Share, and you can use that information to go in and make minor changes to those particular components in a Share interface. Let me ask first, how many people have ever done any kind of Share customization here? Okay, a few, okay. So there's that, and then you can do some other fairly minor tweaking to it without going to a lot of trouble. So the next thing is our document library. Now, as you may have seen in the presentation yesterday, there's a new document library interface that Nathan McMinn has constructed, or I'm sorry, Ray Goss has constructed. And he's done a talk on that, I believe, yesterday. So there's hooks in Share now so that you can build some pretty interesting add-ons. This one shows the what they call the lightbox view. So it's more of a DAM type of interface that they've put into the product. And you can actually use that to build different extensions that you might want to build in the document library as well. So there's a lot of information about how to do that on Ray Gauss's blog. So look there if you would like to do that type of thing. Another user interface that is available to you in Share is the Forms kit. Has anybody ever done any programming with the Forms development kit? Gee, yes. So the Forms kit is a fairly full-featured Forms interface. It has all the types of things that you would want to have in a user interface input form. So it's got text box and drop-downs and that type of thing. And you can change how this looks with different types of CSS if you want to. So you can make it look a lot more dressed up than this. This is sort of the standard type of feature that you get when you build a form. And there's a lot of different functionality that you can use just configuration-wise. If you set up the Share configuration, you can group different pieces of form fields into groups. This gray box here actually is a list of data that's in a group there. So you can move things around on the form, and that's fairly straightforward to do as well. Now, here's an interesting thing. This is the Share activity, or the activity console, that if you go to the admin page and click on the activity console entry there, you'll see this come up. And the interesting thing that you can see here is this one actually has some vector graphics. Now, this interface, as you might notice, it looks a little bit different than the actual Share interface, and you can see it's in a different tab. It actually comes up in a different window than the standard Share user interface. And the reason that is why that happens is because this is an interface that's actually written in a different paradigm called Vaadin. Vaadin is a Java-based server-side way to construct an interface. So basically what you do is you write a Java program that displays what the interface looks like, and then it talks to Alfresco through a RESTful interface. And that's a big key component of constructing a user interface, is being able to get in and out of the repo using RESTful calls. So this is a different example that you can use, and all this code is actually bundled into the base product. There's actually the Vaadin library and the source code that they use to build the Activiti console you can look at and see how they've done this. Now, another interesting place to look for examples of how to build user interfaces is in the records management module. So the new records management module, 2.0, which was released over the summer, has some really interesting techniques in it. And as you can see here, there's some kind of cool looking interfaces that they've built. Now the good stuff about this is this actually uses all of our new best practices. It uses all of our new techniques to build user interfaces. And it actually is packaged how Alfresco would recommend you package interfaces and deploy them. So you can kind of decompile the amps that come with records management and look through them to see all these techniques and how the interfaces are actually constructed. So it's a really good place to go to see how a version 4 interface is actually set up and has a lot of techniques that were discussed in some of the share sessions yesterday. So here's another RM interface here that shows a pop-up dialog. So that's another thing that you can see how to do in there. And finally, here's another RM console that has sort of an interesting layout. So there's a bunch of different techniques you can kind of glean out of that. Now, here's more about what I'm going to actually talk about today, which is an interface that's based on jQuery. Now, how many people saw David Draper's discussion yesterday about Share? A couple? Okay, so some of the stuff that he talked about in Berlin is that he evaluates jQuery every now and then as a basis for using it in new versions of Share. And he's not gone to that because it's got a fairly small set of functionality, and that a lot of the things are actually add-ins to jQuery. But that actual jQuery code has some pretty nice capabilities. And the good thing about it is that you can use it to build a standalone interface. The same set of code can be used inside of Share and outside of Share if you want to. And I'll talk about that a little bit later. So here's an interface that I built using jQuery, and you can see that there's some fairly nice styling there. And I'll talk about how you get into that. And then you can also build some fairly interesting custom widgets like this one that I have down at the bottom, where you can add multiple records that are attached to a single content object in the content store. Here's an example of a pop-up dialog that you can build with jQuery. And so it's, once again, got a bit more functionality that you can drop in, and you can put some other different types of tricks in there. So that's a different way to build an interface. Here's another user interface. This is the Alfresco Partner user interface. And this is based on a Drupal front end that talks to the repo through RESTful calls. And so that's also something you can look at as an example of how to build that type of interface. Drupal has a Alfresco REST project, essentially, that you can pull into a Drupal interface, and it's got a library set up so that you can make calls to the repo. And finally, here's a user interface that's based on Surf itself. So I'll talk about this a little bit more in a second, but Surf is sort of the layer below Share, and it lets you kind of divide the regions on a user interface into a bunch of different sections and then fill in the sections with information that you can pull from any source. So that's actually also useful to you because you can make calls back to the repo once again and get content out of the repo without actually having to use share. All right, so if I wanted to architect a user interface for Alfresco, how would I do that? Well, so you start off with the Alfresco repository, and the Alfresco repository is really bounded by this RESTful interface layer. You can use seamless calls, you can write your own web scripts, whatever you need to do, and then you can get content out of the repository just by making a RESTful call. So that lets you set up different types of situations. One is that you can use share. Share is based on Solar as a kind of a framework layer, but then it still uses the RESTful calls to get in and out of the repository. You can write your own custom user interface that's based directly on share, so that one doesn't have to use share to get in and out. It's just a surf-based interface. Or you can write a custom user interface that's based on another transport, and I'll talk some about how you get in and out of the repository that way. But you can use pretty much any library that you want to. I happen to like jQuery, but you can use Ruby or something else, like I know G likes Ruby, for example. So what are the UI platforms good for then? So if you're going to use share, you might use it in this type of situation where you want to modify some existing pages or add to the existing user interface of share. Or if you want to use surf, that's good for actually building a new type of UI. And a standalone user interface is also good to build a new UI as well. Now, one of the reasons that you might want to use a standalone user interface is because your developers actually have some familiarity with a different type of toolkit than the ones that are actually used by Alfresco. So that might be a good way for you to just leverage their experience and just use the RESTful calls. Now, the interesting thing here is that these things build on top of each other. So at the bottom is what I'm calling the standalone interface, and then Spring is built on top of that, and Share is built on top of Spring. So actually the most complex use case is to build a Share interface, and these other things are subsets of actually building a Share user interface. So what use cases would you use in each one of those cases? Well, for Share, if you have existing users that are familiar with how to use Share, that might be a rationale to actually extend Share. Or especially if you have cases where people need to collaborate using the user interface, Share is built to do that, and it's really good at that. So that might be a reason to actually consider using Share. Secondly, if you want to use Surf, Surf is actually built to reuse user interface components. So if you think about the Share user interface, one of the things that it reuses is the menu bar at the top and the navigation aids. So if you have a user interface built like that, it's a reasonable way to build it using Surf. And you can build out a full-fledged website that way if you want to. So if you think about Share itself, it's really a website of a special kind. For a standalone user interface, if you need a really custom look and feel, like some clients really want to have a thing that doesn't look like Share at all, you can build whatever they want to. You can build a custom website, or you can build something that looks like the user interface that they have now. And once again, you might want to do that also because your developers are familiar with a specific type of tool, and you don't want to have to retrain to actually construct a user interface. All right, so to build a development environment to do user interface construction, if you look at the docs.alfresco.com, there's actually two different ways that are described to do this. There's what I call the old way, the 3.0 way, and then there's a new way that's described under the 4.0 documentation. So I'll talk about both of those. Now, the way that you actually manipulate code in that is based sort of on a directory structure. And in the 4.0 way, you take the directory structure, jar it up, and drop it into the library folder under your webinf directory. The old way, you can actually extend the code directly on the shared classes site under Tomcat. But the directory structures don't exactly match up. They're slightly different. So I've got a zip file that has just the empty directory structures that's up on the page for my talk. And you can use that to just kind of get going in terms of a structure as one way to do that. There's also an Eclipse or Maven project that's available as well. And Gab talked some about the Maven code yesterday. That's another easy way to get a development environment set up rapidly and be able to run targets that deploy the code directly into an Alfresco instance. So here's the directory structure for Alfresco. And if I want to do interactive deployment, where I can actually change code on the fly, reset the server without actually having to stop it, I can deploy to this directory over here, the shared directory, which is under Tomcat. So any classes or any web scripts that I deploy down underneath there, I can refresh using, once again, the index page for share or for the repo. And they'll get interactively pulled in, and then I don't have to stop the server. So that decreases my cycle time. So that shows you where you would put that type of code. Now, that has an advantage that it's easy to develop interactively, but that's not really a very good place to put it in terms of a production deployment. And I'll talk about that in a second. Or you can do this. You can deploy into the lib directory now under the webinf directory under the actual web application. Now, you'll note here that I have a big star under the arrow here. And that's because this is really not a particularly good way to do this either. After I gave this talk, so this is actually what the instructions on docs.alfresco.com say to do, is to build a jar and put it right here. And so I said that in Berlin. And afterwards, I was approached by several of my colleagues at Alfresco, some of whom were carrying torches and pitchforks. And they said, you know, that's really not a best practice. And I said, well, yeah, I know that. That's what it says in the documentation. So if you deploy here, you can still overwrite it over on the shared directory. But either one of those is not really the best way to do that for production deployment. So for production deployment, you should really only use that. You should really only use the lib directory for a development type of deployment. If you want to deploy to a production instance, the best thing to do is to make your jar, or to take the classes that you've put into shared, build them out into an AMP file, and then deploy the AMP file. So if you don't do that, you can have problems later if the AMP file gets re-extracted for any reason. You'll lose those files unless they're deployed into shared. But you'll lose ones that are deployed into the lib directory, and you don't want that to happen unless you've actually got a procedure to handle that. So now, let's talk about building a new page. So also, when I was in Berlin, I saw Dave Draper's talk, and also David Webster's talk, who's sitting in the back. And I thought, wow, there's a whole bunch of stuff here that I haven't really seen before. So I thought, gosh, you know, the talk that I'm going to give is not really got any of this new stuff included. So I'll have to apologize and kind of baseline this. So what you're going to see here is an approach that will actually work with version 3. It also works with version 4, but it doesn't use a lot of the new features of version 4. So anyway, by the end of the talk that David Draper had given, I felt sort of like this. So when I was going to build an example, I thought, well, what can I do to come up with some fairly interesting requirements? Well, how many people know what DITA is? A couple of people. So DITA is an XML standard that allows you to construct a document from smaller pieces of it. So a lot of companies actually have this requirement that build documentation or publications or that type of thing. So the way that you construct the whole document is to build what's called a DITA map. And so the user interface that I'm going to build is actually a map generator for DITA. So what it'll do is look through the repository and find all of the DITA maps, because they're marked in a special way, they have a special type, in the repository, return those, and it'll display a list of those. And then it'll return the actual XML of the DITA map itself, and it'll display that part as a tree that I can edit and add pieces to based on other files that I'm reading in from the repository. I want to be able to integrate that directly into a share site, because publishers often need to be able to do that too. People need to collaborate while they're actually writing topics and building out the map. And then I'd like it to look cool. I want to have a custom style, because publishers also usually have that type of requirement. So based on that, my architecture choices are to use Share, because it's good for collaboration. I'm going to leverage the surf infrastructure to build the page. And then I'm also going to leverage some of the Share infrastructure as well. And to do that, I'm going to create a whole new Share page and put it into a Share site. So I'll show you how to add a page to a site. And then I'm going to use the jQuery tools that I've found to do some of the layout and the interaction. So in order to build a Share page, you have to have at least 3 files. And these are the 3 files. You have to have a page definition file, a template instance definition, and then you have to have a Freemarker template that returns something back to the user. There can be a lot more than this, but you have to have at least this as a minimum. I'll add the Share look and feel into the template so that it looks like a Share page. And then I'll add the jQuery references into that as well so that I can use the jQuery libraries. So the page definition file looks like this. It's just an XML file that tells the Alfresco runtime what the ID is of the page and where the template instance is located. So there's not very much to it. A couple of things about this are that it uses some message bundle stuff. That's where it says like the page.databuilder.title there. That would come from a message bundle. So if you want to actually internationalize your pages, that's the way that you would do it, is you would make a message reference and then have international bundles to back those. So the page that I'm going to build here is called Data Builder. It's at the bottom there. So the next thing I'm going to do is define a template instance that references the Data Builder. This file gets deployed to a directory called site data pages. So you just take this file, put it in there, and then you're one step closer. Next, you build a template instance definition. And the template instance definition doesn't really do very much at all except tell the surf runtime where to get the template from for the page. So that's all that's in that file. So that's really straightforward. You put that in site data template instances. Next, I'm going to build the Freemarker template. So this is a lot more interesting. So the Freemarker template is what I just, on the last page, referenced, right? So on that path, I've got now a file that's called databuilder.ftl. And so there's a bunch of interesting things to talk about on this definition. So if you can see the bolded references there, you can see that there are different regions defined on this page. And this particular template is one that's pretty frequently used inside of Share itself. So it has different regions defined. It's got a header region, it's got a title region, it's got a navigation region, which are those three things that show up at the top of a Share page. And then it's also got a footer, so that kind of completes the Share shell of what the template looks like. Inside of the body part of the template here, there's a region where I'm going to put a selector for my data maps, and then the part where I'm going to display my, my data map itself. Now, another thing that you can note here is that there's a bunch of classes defined. So this sort of zooms in on that body part again, and you can see there's a bunch of different YUI class definitions there. So the YUI class definitions pick up CSS that's defined as a standard part of Share and actually help to divide the page. So you can leverage those things as well. Next, I want to be able to include my header files so that I can get the look and feel correct. So in order to be able to do that, I need to do a couple of things. First of all, I need to be able to pull in the additional Alfresco code that drives some of the top content, the header content, as well as utility functions that can be used by the page itself. So the very top line here, the include definition, is what does that. So if you include that in your code, then you get that piece of the Alfresco framework. And then under the header definition here, the template header, I've put in some of the different pieces of the jQuery that I'll reference. So there's a CSS reference here, there's the jQuery library itself, and then there's a jQuery UI library. So jQuery UI is another library that's built on top of jQuery that gives me a bunch of widget type of functionality. So I'm going to put that directly into the base Freemarker template because I'm going to use a bunch of jQuery calls inside of my, my actual page code. I could actually put that into one of the components, and I'll show you how to do that in a second. So you can actually inject pieces of code back into this header region from some of the smaller region definitions later. And then you deploy that template into this place called, that was defined in the template instance file. So those are the three files that I needed to have. Now I actually have a working definition that I can call to make a page. The jQuery libraries that I'm using have a couple of different things built into them. So there's a CSS file that also includes some images. That's how it makes kind of the unique look and feel there. There's a couple of JavaScript libraries. And you need to be able to deploy those to a location that is accessible to the client-side browser. So in the old way of doing that, you can put that into the web app's root. Or in the new way, you can load those into the jar file under a meta-inf directory, and those will get deployed to the right place. Now, I mentioned jQuery UI a minute ago. So jQuery UI has kind of a nice little tool. You can go up on the web, and they've got this thing called a ThemeRoller. So I can go up there and kind of mess around with a bunch of different templates that they've got. You can see some of the templates over on the other side of the screen there. And I can actually change how those look on a sort of a widget by widget basis, and even on a very fine-grained type of approach. And it'll show you what it looks like here in the center of the screen. So you can kind of preview it, and it'll actually assemble a package for you that has all of the CSS built out for you. So you don't really have to do any messing around with the CSS at all. And it's a fairly nice utility that way. So remember a minute ago I defined some page regions. So I didn't have to do that necessarily, but in order to capture the share look and feel, I did need to do that to put in some of the menu things at the top. So the way that Surf composites a page is it takes all of those regions and goes and makes a call to the back end for each one of those. And it gets a little piece of HTML back for those. And it assembles everything into the final page sort of on a asynchronous basis. So that's what's being represented here is actually the regions and how the components drive that back into the finished page. So once again, this is sort of a 3.0 way of doing things. You take each region that's defined in the Freemarker template, and then you define a component definition for that. So the component definition, this kind of goes through a whole bunch of indirections, but it's actually pretty clear to follow if you take it step by step. So the template here is defining the region that I had in that body page that was called did a map selector, which is where I'm going to pick my map on the one side of the page. And it's going to map that to an action class at the bottom here, which is called the data map selector, and I'm giving it a URL there that I can follow down to the actual code. So I'm going to have one of these region mapping files for each one of the region defined in my template. And then I deploy those to that directory site data components. Now, my component web scripts, a lot of you have probably seen this picture before. They're based on a model view controller paradigm. So I come in, I have a definition that basically maps to that other component definition that I just showed you. And it intercepts that call when it goes to the back end. It goes to the back end to the repo, builds up a model that contains the data that I want to display, and then it returns it back to a view. So the view has a little piece of HTML in it, and that returns back to the Freemarker template, and that's how the page gets filled in region by region. So for the jQuery the jQuery page that I've got here, I'm going to actually put some additional code into that page. So this is what I was talking a minute ago about header injection. I can take the Freemarker code for the actual little piece of the header, and I can put in this jQuery call, which builds an accordion UI widget. So an accordion is like a thing that when I click on it, it expands that part of the widget, and then there's a bunch of other little pieces of it there. So in order to put that widget in, this is all the code that I need to set up to begin with. After this, I'll need to put in some callbacks and that type of thing to actually handle the actions. But this is really all the code that you need just to make it show up. So this code gets executed when the page loads, and then it fills in the rest of the references here. So there's an ID there that actually points back to the reference up in the script here. So this is the code that actually gets displayed for the accordion itself. So to add the page to a share site, there's just a little piece of XML configuration that you do for that. So this is a little piece of code that you stick into a shared config custom, and it tells Share to add this new page to the list of pages that it's got that you can put onto a site. So that shows up for like an administrator when you say, I'd like to configure a site, and you go off to the page that has a list of the pages like the wiki and all that type of stuff. So that will make this page show up on that page. And what you want to do here, the important part of this is where it says replace equals false. So it evaluates the the conditions. If it finds this condition, it'll add this as an incremental addition instead of replacing all the ones that are there. So after we did all that stuff, here's what we got. So we got this page that looks like this with a bunch of little teeny tiny writing on it. So over on the far side of the page is the accordion widget. And then in the middle here is my tree widget, which is not a standard part of the jQuery UI, so I had to kind of drop that in as well. But this took me about 2 or 3 hours, and so I've actually built a shell of a page in a fairly short amount of time, and now I can actually go back into the back end and start putting in the code to actually drive this page. So if you follow this stepwise process, you can get to where you want to go to in a fairly rapid manner. So to summarize that, you build a jar. There's 2 directories in the jar. There's an Alfresco branch and a meta-inf branch. The first thing that I do is I build a page reference. I put that under site data pages. And if there's any messages that are bound to that page, then I would make a message file for that as well. The next thing I would do is I would make a template instance file and put that into the template instances directory. The next thing I would do is to actually make the Freemarker template, and I would put that into the location specified by the template instance. I would take the CSS and JavaScript that I pulled down from the jQuery site or whatever library I'm trying to drop in, and I would put that under the meta-inf directory. And you can name the parent directory there anything you would like. And then I would actually build some component pieces that reference the regions that are in my template. Finally, I would actually build some web scripts that map to the component files, and I would put those under the path that's specified in the component files that I just created. So once all that's created, I'm ready to go, and I can add my page to the share config file, and that's pretty much everything you need to do to create a new share page. Now, if I wanted to build a surf page by itself, or if I wanted to build a standalone page, those are subsets of what I just did. So to build a share page, I would just sort of leave out the Alfresco configuration, still use the surf configuration, so I'd still have a Freemarker page with regions and components. I'd still have this type of script mapping on the back end so that I can get back to pull code out of the repo. But I would just set up surf as an independent web application. If I was going to build a standalone page, if I build my JavaScript in a way that it doesn't depend on any Alfresco calls, I can just take the JavaScript out of there and I can build its own web page and just serve that directly off of a server. So that's kind of an interesting thing that you can do with this, is you're actually able to build JavaScript that you can run inside of Surf, or you can pull it out of Surf and run it as an independent page if you want to have people that are external to your company be able to get into the repo for any area, or you can change that so it's some subset of that. Now, to call a web script, there's a couple of different ways to do that. There's some Alfresco utility classes that get bound into your page when you do that include that I showed you a couple of minutes ago. So you can make an AJAX request like this that goes to the back end, calls a web script, and then gets a return back. And you can take that call back and then update the map widget that you've got there. So that's just a bunch of JavaScript that would go into the header. A different way to do that is to use the AJAX call that's built into jQuery. So this is a slightly different set of code here, and you can see it's fairly similar, does the same type of thing. But the important part is that it gets back to the URI that loads that page. So To actually try to learn this stuff, the first time I tried to build one of these pages, this took me weeks to actually go through some of the references to figure out how to do some of these things. But there's several different books that are pretty good. I like these three. There's, of course, the book that was written by the engineering staff. All of these books are actually pretty specific to version 3. They don't have any version 4 information in them. The records management book, interestingly enough, actually, in addition to describing how records management works really well, has a section after it describes what it does. It goes into how it's actually implemented on a piece-by-piece basis. So that's a fairly interesting reference as well. And then the other one is Jeff Pott's book, which is an excellent reference to how to develop. We also have a new training class, which is called Advanced Share Development. And I've taken that class. It's a really good class. Or you can look for the blogs that the developers actually write. And this is how you would find out about what the very newest features are that are built into Share. Now, the special announcement. So after I saw David Draper's talk in Berlin, I went to Dave and I said, well, Dave, you know, I'm having a little bit of trouble keeping up because some of this stuff is not getting disseminated in the field very well. So I said, well, what can we do to solve that? How about if we took examples like this, little tutorial examples, and I'll try to build one of those like every quarter for the latest stuff that you've built, and I'll run it by you to make sure that it works, based on the way that you would recommend to do it. And he said, let's do that. So I'm actually going to try to start an initiative, and my management, I guess, all left the room, so I haven't told them this. But so I'm going to try to start an initiative to actually build some example code for you. Now, what I need from you guys, here's your action item, is please contact me and let me know what you would like those examples to be. So anything that you would really like to see from a user interface basis, or from actually any other basis, Activiti or core repo or anything at all, I've got contacts now. Please let me know, and I'll try to build out some tutorials for you so that you've got some examples to work from, because I know that if you guys have a little example to reverse engineer, you should be able to do the rest on your own. So that's my commitment to you. Exactly where we're going to put those, I'm not really sure, but that's why I need to talk to my management. So, to summarize, there's a stepwise process to create a share page that's fairly simple to follow if you know what the steps are. You can include third-party libraries, and you can actually inject JavaScript into the headers to make it all work cool. So you can keep the code kind of separated. And you can leverage the Alfresco framework as one way to post calls into the backend. Or you can use the third-party calls to do that same type of thing, and that actually makes the code portable outside of Share. Another good thing to do is to look at the RM implementation for an example of how to build a user interface that would be our best practices. And then finally, go crazy and build some cool user interfaces. So, any questions that I could answer? Let's see. How about, let's start way in the back there. Yeah. That's a good point. Now, see, that's a version 4 thing. Yeah, and so this, like I said, this code is really more around version 3 way of doing things. I'm going to build another version of this tutorial that's based on the version 4 way of doing things. So what he's referring to is some of the stuff that David Draper talked about, which they have some really interesting techniques in version 4 of actually being able to rewrite and rearrange the code dynamically. So you don't need to do some of this header injection stuff. In fact, they tell you not to do that anymore. So that was why I went to talk to Dave. But yes. That's the other thing to know is sometimes pieces of the application just sort of fall away and you don't really know that they're not there until you don't find them. That I haven't seen. It actually, the calls that I made here were that took them pretty directly into the back end. So, well, yeah. It actually, if you take the page after it's been pushed out and look at how it stacks everything up inside, you'll see how it actually stuffs that stuff in there. Is that what you're asking? Okay, go ahead. Oh, David is there. Thanks, Dave. I didn't even see you sitting there. All right, some more questions? G, did you have one? Okay. Anybody else? All right, yeah?
Yeah, so the books that you recommended, are they still relevant to 4.2?
Well, so everything is forward compatible, right? I mean, like you can take version 3 code and it will execute on version 4. And it's really a good way to actually learn what's going on from a share perspective, especially. Or from a surf perspective, I mean. So I would definitely still recommend learning those. There aren't really any version 4 books available right now. I don't know if anybody's planning on updating any of the books they've written. But that's sort of what we're going to try to address with some of the tutorial type of things too. All right, any other questions? All right, well, thanks very much for coming. Appreciate it.